6. On the Martian Sea. The galley raised a fair breeze at last, and the slaves were allowed to rest. Again, Carr slept. When he awoke for the second time, it was dawn. Through the oar-port, he watched the sea change color with the sunrise. He had never seen anything so ironically beautiful. The water caught the pale tints of the first light and warmed them with its own phosphorescent fire, amethyst and pearl and rose and saffron. Then, as the sun rose higher, the sea changed to one sheet of burning gold. Karst watched until the last color had faded, leaving the water white again. He was sorry when it was all gone. It was all unreal, and he could pretend that he was still asleep in Madame Cahn's on the low canal, dreaming the dreams that come with too much thill. Bagaz snored untroubled by his side. The drummer slept beside his drum. The slaves dropped over the oars, resting. Karst looked at them. They were a vicious, hard-bitten lot, mostly convicted criminals, he supposed. He thought he could recognize Jakaran, Valkesian, and Keshi types. But a few of them, like the third man at his own oar, were of a different breed. Khans, he supposed, and he could see why he had been mistaken for one of them. They were big, raw-boned men with light eyes and fair or ruddy hair, and a barbarian look that Karst liked. His gaze dropped to the catwalk, and he saw clearly now the two creatures who lay shackled there. The same breed as those who had cheered him in the square last night, from the wharfside ships. They were not human, not quite. They were kin to the seal and the dolphin, to the strong, perfect loveliness of a cresting wave. Their bodies were covered with a short, dark fur, thinning to a fine down on the face. Their features were delicately cut, handsome. They rested, but did not sleep, and their eyes were open, large and dark, and full of intelligence. These, he guessed, were what Jakarans had referred to as swimmers. He wondered what their function was aboard ship. One was a man, the other a woman. He could not somehow think of them as merely male and female, like beasts. He realized that they were studying him with fixed curiosity. A small shiver ran over him. There was something uncanny about their eyes, as though they could see beyond ordinary horizons. The woman spoke in a soft voice. "Welcome to the Brotherhood of the Lash." Her tone was friendly, yet he sensed in it a certain reserve, a note of puzzlement. Karst smiled at her. "Thanks." Again he was conscious that he spoke the old High Martian with an accent. It was going to be a problem to explain his race, for he knew that the Khans themselves would not make the same mistake the Jakarans had. The next words of the swimmer convinced him of that. "You are not of Condor," she said, "though you resemble its people. What is your country?" A man's rough voice joined in. "Yes, what is it, stranger?" Karst turned to see that the big Khan slave, who was third man on his oar, was eyeing him with hostile suspicion. The man went on. "Word went round that you were a captured Khan spy, but that's a lie. More likely you're a Jakaran masquerading as a Khan, set here among us by the socks." A low growl ran through the oar-bank. Karst had known he would have to account for himself somehow, and had been thinking quickly. Now he spoke up. "I'm not Jakaran, but a tribesman from far beyond Shun. From so far that all this is like a new world to me." "You might be," the big Khan conceded grudgingly. "You've got a queer look and way of talking. What brought you and this hog of Valkis aboard?" Bagaz was awake now, and the fat Valkesian answered hastily. "My friend and I were wrongfully accused of theft by the Sox. The shame of it! I, Bagaz of Valkis, convicted of pilfering. An outrage on justice." The Khan spat disgustedly and turned away. "I thought so." Presently, Bagaz found an opportunity to whisper to Kars. "They think now we're a pair of condemned thieves. Best let them think so, my friend." "What are you but that?" Kars retorted brutally. Bagaz studied him with shrewd little eyes. "What are you, friend?" "You heard me. I come from far beyond Shun." From beyond Shun, and from beyond this whole world, Kars thought grimly. But he couldn't tell these people the incredible truth about himself. The fat Valkesian shrugged. "If you wish to stick to that, it's all right with me. I trust you implicitly. Are we not partners?" Kars smiled sourly at that ingenious question. There was something about the impudence of this fat thief which he found amusing. Bagaz detected his smile. "Ah, you are thinking of my unfortunate violence towards you last night. It was mere impulsiveness. We shall forget it. I, Bagaz, have already forgotten it," he added magnanimously. "The fact remains that you, my friend, possess the secret of—" he lowered his voice to a murmur, "of the tomb of Rhiannon. It's lucky that child was too ignorant to recognize the sword, for that secret, rightly exploited, can make us the biggest men on Mars." Kars asked him, "Why is the tomb of Rhiannon so important?" The question took Bagaz off guard. He looked startled. "Do you pretend you don't even know that?" Kars reminded, "I told you I come from so far that this is all a new world to me." Bagaz's fat face showed mixed incredulity and puzzlement. Finally, he said, "I can't decide whether you're really what you say, or whether you're pretending childish ignorance for your own reasons." He shrugged. "Whichever is the case, you could soon get the story from the others. I might as well be truthful." He spoke in a rapid undertone, watching Kars shrewdly. "Even a remote barbarian will have heard of the superhuman Quiru, who long ago possessed all power and scientific wisdom, and of how the cursed one among them, Rhiannon, sinned by teaching too much wisdom to the Duvians. Because of what that led to, the Quiru left our world, going no man knows whither. But before they left, they seized the sinner Rhiannon and locked him in a hidden tomb, and locked in with him his instruments of awful power. Is it wonderful that all Mars has hunted that tomb for an age? Is it strange that either the Empire of Sark or the Sea Kings would do anything to possess the Cursed One's lost powers? And now that you have found the tomb, do I, Bagaz, blame you for being cautious with your secret?" Kars ignored the last. He was remembering now, remembering those strange instruments of jewels and prisms and metal in Rhiannon's tomb. Were those really the secrets of an ancient great science, a science that had long been lost to the half-barbaric Mars of this age? He asked, "Who are these Sea Kings? I take it that they're enemies of the Sarks?" Bagaz nodded. "Sarks rules the lands east, north, and south of the White Sea. But in the west are small free kingdoms of hardy sea rovers like the Khans, and their sea kings defy the power of Sark." He added, "Aye, and there are many even in my own subject land of Valkis, and elsewhere, who secretly hate Sark because of the Duvians." "The Duvians?" Kars repeated. "You mentioned them before. Who are they?" Bagaz snorted. "Look, friend, it's all very well to pretend ignorance, but that's carrying it too far. There's no tribesman from so far away that he doesn't know and fear the accursed serpent." So the serpent was a generic name from the mysterious Duvians. Why were they called so? Karst wondered. Karst became suddenly aware that the woman swimmer was looking at him fixedly. For a startled moment, he had the eerie sensation that she was looking into his thoughts. "Shala is watching us. Best be quiet now," Bagaz whispered hastily. "Everyone knows that the halflings can read the mind a little." If that was so, Karst thought grimly, Shala the swimmer must have found profoundly astonishing matter in his own thoughts. He had been pitchforked into a wholly unfamiliar Mars, most of which was still a mystery to him. But if Bagaz spoke truth, if those strange objects in the tomb of Rhiannon were instruments of a great lost scientific power, then even though he was a slave, he held the key to a secret coveted by all this world. That secret could be his death. He must guard it jealously till he won free of this brutal bondage. For a resolve to regain his freedom and a grim growing hatred of the swaggering Sarks were all that he was sure of now. The sun rose high, blazing down into the unprotected ore pit. The wind that hummed through the taut cordage aloft did nothing to relieve the heat down here. The men broiled like fish on a griddle, and so far neither food nor water had been forthcoming. Karst watched with sullen eyes the Sark soldiers lounging arrogantly on the deck above the sunken ore pit. On the after part of that deck rose the main cabin, the door to which remained closed. Atop the flat roof stood the steersman, a husky Sark sailor who held the massive tiller and who took his orders from Shield. Shield himself stood up there, his spade beard thrust up as he looked unseeingly over the misery in the ore pit toward the distant horizon. Occasionally, he rapped out curt commands to the steersman. Rations came at last, black bread and a pannikin of water, served out by one of the strange winged slaves Karst had glimpsed before in Jakara. The Sky Folk, the mob had called them. Karst studied this one with interest. He looked like a crippled angel, with his shining wings cruelly broken and his beautiful suffering face. He moved slowly along the catwalk at his task, as though walking were a burden to him. He did not smile or speak, and his eyes were veiled. Shala thanked him for her food. He did not look at her, but went away, dragging his empty basket. She turned to Karst. "Most of them," she said, "die when their wings are broken." He knew she meant a death of the spirit. And sight of that broken-winged halfling somehow gave Karst a bitterer hatred of the Sarks than his own enslavement had aroused. "Curse the brutes who would do a thing like that," he muttered. "Aye, cursed be they who foregather in evil with the serpent," growled Jaxart, the big Khand at their oar. "Cursed be their king and his she-devil daughter, Uwain. Had I the chance, I'd sink us all beneath the waves to thwart whatever deviltry she's been hatching at Jakara." "Why hasn't she shown herself?" Karst asked. "Is she so delicate that she'll keep her cabin all the way to Sark?" "That hell-cat's delicate?" Jaxart spat in loathing and said, "She's wantoning with her lover, hidden in her cabin. He crept aboard at Sark, all hooded and cloaked, and hasn't come out since. But we saw him." Shala looked aft with fixed gaze and murmured, "It is no lover she is hiding, but a cursed evil. I sensed it when it came aboard." She turned her disturbing luminous gaze on Karst. "I think there is a curse on you, too, stranger. I can feel it, but I cannot understand you." Karst again felt a little chill. These halflings with their extrasensory powers could just vaguely sense his incredible alienage. He was glad when Shala and Naram, her mate, turned away from him. Often in the hours that followed, Kars found his gaze going up to the afterdeck. He had a grim desire to see this Owain of Sark, whose slave he now was. In mid-afternoon, after blowing steadily for hours, the wind began to fail and dropped finally to a flat calm. The drum thundered. The sweeps went out, and once again Kars was sweating at the unfamiliar labor, snarling at the kiss of the lash on his back. Only Bagaz seemed happy. "I am no seafaring man," he said, shaking his beard. "For a Khond like you, Jaxart, sea-roving is natural. But I was delicate in my youth, and forced to quieter pursuits. Ah, blessed calm! Even the drudgery of the oars is preferable to bounding like a wild thing over the waves." Kars was touched by this pathetic speech, until he discovered that Bagaz had good reason not to mind the rowing, inasmuch as he was only bending back and forth, while Kars and Jaxart pulled. Kars dealt him a blow that nearly knocked him off the bench, and after that he pulled his weight, groaning. The afternoon wore on, hot and endless, to the ceaseless beat of the oars. The palms of Kars's hand blistered, then broke and bled. He was a powerful man, but even so the strength ran out of him like water, and his body felt as though it had been stretched on the rack. He envied Jaxart, who behaved as though he had been born in the oar-banks. Gradually, sheer exhaustion dulled his agony somewhat. He fell into a sort of drugged stupor, wherein his body performed its task mechanically. Then, in the last golden glaze of daylight, he lifted his head to gasp for breath, and saw, through the wavering haze that obscured his vision, a woman standing on the deck above him, looking at the sea. 7. The Sword. She might be both Sark and devil, as the others had said. But whatever she was, she stopped Kars's breath and held him staring. She stood like a dark flame in a nimbus of sunset light. Her habit was that of a young warrior, a hauberk of black mail over a short purple tunic, with a jeweled dragon coiling on the curve of her mailed breast, and a short sword at her side. Her head was bare. She wore her black hair short, cut square above the eyes, and falling to her shoulders. Under dark brows, her eyes had smoldering fires in them. She stood with straight long legs braced slightly apart, peering out over the sea. Kars felt the surge of bitter admiration. This woman owned him, and he hated her, and all her race, but he could not deny her burning beauty and her strength. "Row, you carrion!" The oath and the lash brought him back from his staring. He had lost stroke, fouling the whole starboard bank, and Jaxart was cursing, and Callus was using the whip. He beat them all impartially, and fat Bagaz wailed at the top of his lungs, "Mercy, O Lady Owain! Mercy! Mercy!" "Shut up, scum!" snarled Callus, and lashed them until blood ran. Owain glanced down into the pit. She rapped out a name. "Callus!" The Oakbank captain bowed. "Yes, Highness." "Pick up the beat," she said. "Faster! I want to raise the black banks at dawn." She looked directly at Kars and Bagaz and added, "Flog every man who loses stroke." She turned away. The drumbeat quickened. Kars looked with bitter eyes at Owain's back. It would be good to tame this woman. It would be good to break her utterly, to tear her pride out by the roots and stamp on it. The lash rapped out the time on his unwilling back, and there was nothing for it but to row. Jaxart grinned a wolf's grin. Between strokes he panted, "Sark rules the White Sea, to hear them tell it. But the Sea Kings still come out. Even Owain won't dawdle on the way." If their enemies may be out, why don't they have escort ships for this galley? Kars asked, gasping. Jaxart shook his head. That I can't understand myself. I heard that Garach sent his daughter to overawe the subject king of Jakara, who's been getting too ambitious. But why she came without escort ships? Bagaz suggested. Perhaps the Duvians furnished her with some of their mysterious weapons for protection. The big Khan snorted. The Duvians are too crafty to do that. They'll use their strange weapons sometimes in behalf of their Sark allies, yes. That's why the alliance exists. But give weapons to Sark. Teach Sarks how to use them? They're not that foolish. Kars was getting a clearer idea of this ancient Mars. These peoples were all half barbaric, all but the mysterious Duvians. They apparently possessed at least some of the ancient science of this world, and jealously guarded it and used it for their own and their Sark allies' purposes. Night fell. Owain remained on deck, and the watches were doubled. Naram and Shala, the two swimmers, stirred restlessly in their shackles. In the torchlit gloom, their eyes were luminous with some secret excitement. Kars had neither the strength nor the inclination to appreciate the wonder of the glowing sea by moonlight. To make matters worse, a headwind sprang up and roughened the waves to an ugly cross-chop that made the oars doubly difficult to handle. The drum beat inexorably. A dull fury burned in Kars. He ached intolerably. He bled, and his back was striped by fiery wheels. The oar was heavy. It was heavier than all Mars, and it bucked and fought him like a live thing. Something happened to his face. A strange stony look came over it, and all the color went out of his eyes, leaving them bleak as ice and not quite sane. The drumbeat merged into the pounding of his own heart, roaring louder with every painful stroke. A wave sprang up. The long sweep crabbed the handle, took Kars across the chest, and knocked the wind out of him. Jaxart, who was experienced, and Bagaz, who was heavy, regained control almost at once, though not before the overseer was on hand to curse them for lazy carrion, his favorite word, and to lay on the whip. Kars let go of the oar. He moved so fast, in spite of his hampering chains, that the overseer had no idea what was happening until suddenly he was lying across the Earthman's knees and trying to protect his head from the blows of the Earthman's wrist cuffs. Instantly, the oar bank went mad. The stroke was hopelessly lost. Men shouted for the kill. Callus rushed up and hit Kars over the head with a loaded butt of his whip, knocking him half senseless. The overseer scrambled back to safety, eluding Jaxart's clutching arms. Bagaz made himself as small as possible and did nothing. Owain's voice came down from the deck. Callus! The oar-bank captain knelt, trembling. Yes, Highness? Flog them all until they remember that they're no longer men, but slaves. Her angry, impersonal gaze rested on Kars. As for that one, he's new, isn't he? Yes, Highness. Teach him, she said. They taught him. Callus and the overseer together taught him. Kars bowed his head over his arms and took it. Now and again Bagaz screamed as the lash flicked too far over and caught him instead. Between his feet, Kars saw dimly the red streams that trickled down into the bilges and stained the water. The rage that had burned in him chilled and altered as iron tempers under the hammer. At last they stopped. Kars raised his head. It was the greatest effort he had ever made, but stiffly, stubbornly, he raised it. He looked directly at Owain. Have you learned your lesson, slave? She asked. It was a long time before he could form the words to answer. He was beyond caring now whether he lived or died. His whole universe was centered on the woman who stood arrogant and untouchable above him. "Come down yourself and teach me if you can," he answered hoarsely, and called her a name in the lowest vernacular of the streets, a name that said there was nothing she could teach a man. For a moment no one moved or spoke. Carr saw her face go white, and he laughed, a hoarse, terrible sound in the silence. Then Childe drew his sword and vaulted over the rail into the ore pit. The blade flashed high and bright in the torchlight. It occurred to Carse that he had traveled a long way to die. He waited for the stroke, but it did not come, and then he realized that Owain had cried out to Childe to stop. Childe faltered, then turned, puzzled, looking up. "But Highness—" "Come here," she said, and Carr saw that she was staring at the sword in Childe's hand, the sword of Rhiannon. Childe climbed the ladder back up to the deck, his black-browed face a little frightened. Owain met him. "Give me that," she said, and when he hesitated, "The sword, fool!" He laid it in her hands, and she stood looking at it, turning it over in the torchlight, studying the workmanship, the hilt with its single smoky jewel, the etched symbols on the blade. "Where did you get this, Childe?" He stammered, not liking to make the admission, his hand going instinctively to his stolen collar. Owain snapped. "Your thieving doesn't interest me. Where did you get it?" He pointed to Carse and Bagaz. "From them, Highness, when I picked them up." She nodded. "Fetch them off to my quarters." She disappeared inside the cabin. Childe, unhappy and completely bewildered, turned to obey her order, and Bagaz moaned. "Oh, merciful gods," he whispered. "That's done it." He leaned closer to Carse and said rapidly, while he still had the chance, "Lie as you never lied before. If she thinks you know the secret of the tomb, she or the Duvians will force it out of you." Carse said nothing. He was having all he could do to retain consciousness. Childe called profanely for wine, which was brought. He forced some of it down Carse's throat, then had him and Bagaz released from the oar and marched up to the afterdeck. The wine and the sea wind up on the deck revived Carse enough so that he could keep his feet under him. Childe ushered them urgently into Owain's torchlit cabin, where she sat with the sword of Rhiannon laid on the carven table before her. In the opposite bulkhead was a low door leading to an inner cabin. Carr saw that it was open the merest crack. No light showed, but he got the feeling that someone, something, was crouching behind it, listening. It made him remember Jaxart's word and Shala's. There was a taint in the air, a faint musky odor, dry and sickly. It seemed to come from that inner cabin. It had a strange effect on Carse. Without knowing what it was, he hated it. He thought that if it was a lover Owain was hiding in there, it must be a strange sort of lover. Owain took his mind off that. Her gaze stabbed at him, and once again he thought that he had never seen such eyes. Then she said to Childe, "Tell me the full story." Uncomfortably, in halting sentences, he told her. Owain looked at Bagaz. "And you, fat one, how did you come by the sword?" Bagaz sighed, nodded at Carse. "From him, Highness. It's a handsome weapon, and I'm a thief by trade." "Is that the only reason you wanted it?" Bagaz's face was a model of innocent surprise. "What other reason could there be? I'm no fighting man. Besides, there were the belt and collar. You can see for yourself, Highness, that are all valuable." Her face did not show whether she believed him or not. She turned to Carse. "The sword belonged to you, then?" "Yes." "Where did you get it?" "I bought it from a trader." "Where?" In the northern country, beyond Shun. Owain smiled. You lie. Kars said wearily. I came by the weapon honestly. He had, in a sense. And I don't care whether you believe it or not. The crack of that inner door mocked Kars. He wanted to break it open, to see what crouched there, listening, watching out of the darkness. He wanted to see what made that hateful smell. Almost, it seemed, there was no need for that. Almost, it seemed, he knew. Unable to contain himself any longer, Scyld burst out. Your pardon, Highness, but why all this fuss about the sword? You're a good soldier, Scyld, she answered thoughtfully, but in many ways a blockhead. Did you clean this blade? Of course, and bad condition it was in, too. He glanced disgustedly at Kars. It looked as though he hadn't touched it for years. Owain reached out and laid her hand upon the jeweled hilt. Kars saw that it trembled. She said softly, You were right, Scyld. It hadn't been touched. For years. Not since Rhiannon, who made it, was walled away in his tomb to suffer for his sins. Scyld's face went completely blank. His jaw dropped. After a long while, he said one word. Rhiannon. 8. The Thing in the Dark. Owain's level gaze fastened on Kars. He knows the secret of the tomb, Scyld. He must know it, if he had the sword. She paused, and when she spoke again, her words were almost inaudible, like the voicing of an inner thought. A dangerous secret. So dangerous that I almost wish... She broke off short, as though she had already said too much. Did she glance quickly at the inner door? In her old imperious tone, she said to Kars, One more chance, slave. Where is the tomb of Rhiannon? Kars shook his head. I know nothing, he said, and gripped Bagaz's shoulder to steady himself. Little crimson droplets had trickled down to dye the rug under his feet. Owain's face seemed far away. Scyld said hoarsely, Give him to me, Highness. No, he's too far gone for your methods now. I don't want him killed yet. I must take thought to this. She frowned, looking from Kars to Bagaz and back again. They object to rowing, I believe. Very well. Take the third man off their oar. Let these two work it without help all night, and tell Callus to lay the lash on the fat one twice in every glass, 5 strokes. Bagaz wailed, Highness, I implore you. I would tell if I could, but I know nothing. I swear it. She shrugged. Perhaps not. In that case, you will wish to persuade your comrade to talk. She turned again to Scyld. Tell Callus also to douse the tall one with seawater as often as he needs it. Her white teeth glinted. It has a healing property. Scyld laughed. Owain motioned him to go. See that they're kept at it, but on no account is either one to die. When they're ready to talk, bring them to me. Scyld saluted and marched his prisoners back again to the rowers' pit. Jack's art was taken off the oar, and the endless nightmare of the dark hours continued for Kars. Bagaz was crushed and trembling. He screamed mightily as he took his 5 strokes, and then moaned in Kars's ear. I wish I'd never seen your bloody sword. She'll take us to Caer-Du, and the gods have mercy on us. Kars bared his teeth in what might have been a grin. You talked differently in Jakara. I was a free man then, and the Duvians were far away. Kars felt some deep and buried nerve contract at the mention of that name. He said in an odd voice, "Bagaz, what was that smell in the cabin?"
"Smell? I noticed none."
Strange, Kars thought,
When it drove me nearly mad.
or perhaps I'm mad already. Jack's heart was right, Bagaz. There is someone hidden there in the inner cabin. With some irritation, Bagaz said,
"Owain's wantoning is nothing to me."
They labored in silence for a while. Then Kars asked abruptly, "Who are the Duvians?" Bagaz stared at him.
"Where do you really come from, man?"
"As I told you, from far beyond Shun."
"It must have been from far indeed, if you haven't heard of Caer-Du and the serpent."
Then Bagaz shrugged his fat shoulders as he labored.
"You're playing some deep game of your own, I suppose. All this pretend ignorance. But I don't mind playing that game with you."
He went on.
"You know at least that since long ago there have been human peoples on our world, and also the not-quite-human peoples, the halflings. Of the humans, the great Quiru, who are gone, were the grandest. They had so much science and wisdom that they're still revered as superhuman. But there were also the halflings, the races who are man-like, but not descended of the same blood. The swimmers who sprang from the sea creatures, and the sky folk who came from the winged things, and the Duvians who are from the serpent."
A cold breath swept through Kars. Why was it that all this which he heard for the first time seemed so familiar to him? Certainly he had never heard before this story of ancient Martian evolution, of intrinsically alien stocks evolving into superficially similar pseudo-human peoples. He had not heard it before. Or had he?
"Crafty and wise as the snake that fathered them were the Duvians always," Bagaz was continuing. "So crafty that they prevailed on Rhiannon of the Quiru to teach them some of his science. Some, but not all. Yet what they learned was enough that they could make their black city of Caer-Du impregnable, and could occasionally intervene with their scientific weapons so as to make their Sark allies the dominant human nation."
"And that was Rhiannon's sin?" Kars said.
"Aye, that was the Cursed One's sin. For in his pride he had defied the other Quiru, who counseled him not to teach the Duvians such powers. For that sin, the other Quiru condemned Rhiannon and entombed him in a hidden place before they left our world. At least, so says the legend."
"But the Duvians themselves are no mere legend?"
"They are not, damn them,"
Bagaz muttered.
"They are the reason all free men hate the Sarks, who hold evil alliance with the serpent."
They were interrupted by the broken-winged slave, Lorn. He had been sent to dip up a bucket of seawater, and now appeared with it. The winged man spoke, and even now his voice had music in it.
"This will be painful, stranger. Bear it if you can. It will help you."
He raised the bucket. Glowing water spilled out, covering Kars's body with a bright sheath. Kars knew why Owain had smiled. Whatever chemical gave the sea its phosphorescence might be healing, but the curse was worse than the wounds. The corrosive agony seemed to eat the flesh from his bones. The night wore on, and after a while, Kars felt the pain grow less. His wheals no longer bled, and the water began to refresh him. To his own surprise, he saw the second dawn break over the white sea. Soon after sunrise, a cry came down from the masthead. The black banks lay ahead. Through the oar-port, Kars saw a welter of broken water that stretched for miles. Reefs and shoals, with here and there black jagged fangs of rock showing through the foam.
"They're not going to try to run that mess," he exclaimed. "It's the shortest route to Sock," Bagaz said. "As for running the banks, why do you suppose every Sock galley carries captive swimmers?" "I've wondered. You'll soon see."
Owain came on deck, and Child joined her. They did not look down at the two haggard scarecrows sweating at the oar. Bagaz instantly wailed piteously, "Mercy, Highness!" Owain paid no attention. She ordered Child, "Slow the beat, and send the swimmers out." Naram and Shala were unshackled and ran forward. Metal harnesses were locked to their bodies. Long wire lines ran from these harnesses to ring bolts in the forecastle deck. The two swimmers dived fearlessly into the foaming waters. The wire lines tautened, and Karst glimpsed the heads of the two bobbing like corks as they swam smoothly ahead of the galley into the roaring banks.
"You see," said Bagaz, "they feel out the channel. They can guide a ship through anything."
To the slow beat of the drum, the black galley forged into the broken water. Owain stood, hair flying in the breeze and hauberk shining, by the man at the tiller. She and Child peered closely ahead. The rough waters shook along the keel with a hiss and a snarl, and once an oar splintered on a rock, but they crept on safely. It was a long, slow, weary passage. The sun rose toward the zenith. There was an aching tension aboard the galley. Karst only dimly heard the roar of breakers as he and Bagaz labored at their oar. The fat Valkesian was groaning ceaselessly now. Karst's arms felt like lead. His brain seemed clamped in steel. At last the galley found smooth water, shot clear of the banks. Their dull thunder came now from astern. The swimmers were hauled back in. Owain glanced down into the oar pit for the first time, at the staggering slaves.
"Give them a brief rest," she rapped. "The wind should rise soon."
Her eyes swung to Karst and Bagaz.
"And Child, I'll see those two again now."
Karst watched Child cross the deck and come down the ladder. He felt a sick apprehension. He did not want to go up to that cabin again. He did not want to see again that door with its mocking crack, nor smell that sickly evil smell. But he and Bagaz were again unshackled and herded aft, and there was nothing he could do. The door swung shut behind them. Child, Owain behind the carved table, the sword of Rhiannon gleaming before her. The tainted air and the low door of the bulkhead, not quite closed, not quite. Owain spoke.
"You've had the first taste of what I can do to you. Do you want the second? Or will you tell me the location of Rhiannon's tomb and what you found there?"
Karst answered tonelessly, "I told you before that I don't know." He was not looking at Owain. That inner door fascinated him, held his gaze. Somewhere, far at the back of his mind, something stirred and woke. A prescience, a hate, a horror that he could not understand. But he understood well enough that this was the climax, the end. A deep shudder ran through him, an involuntary tightening of nerves.
"What is it that I do not know, but can somehow almost remember?"
Owain leaned forward.
"You're strong. You pride yourself on that. You feel that you can stand physical punishment, perhaps more than I would dare to give you. I think you could. But there are other ways, quicker, surer ways, and even a strong man has no defense against them."
She followed the line of his gaze to the inner door.
"Perhaps," she said softly, "you can guess what I mean."
Karst's face was empty now of all expression. The musky smell was heavy as smoke in his throat. He felt it coil and writhe inside him, filling his lungs, stealing into his blood. Poisonously subtle, cruel, cold with a primal coldness. He swayed on his feet, but his fixed stare did not waver. He said hoarsely, "I can guess." "Good. Speak now, and that door need not open." Karst laughed, a low, harsh sound. His eyes were clouded and strange. "Why should I speak? You would only destroy me later to keep the secret safe." He stepped forward. He knew that he moved. He knew that he spoke, though the sound of his own voice was vague in his ears. But there was a dark confusion in him. The veins of his temples stood out like knotted cords, and the blood throbbed in his brain. Pressure, as if something bursting, breaking its bonds, tearing itself free. He did not know why he stepped forward, toward that door. He did not know why he cried out in a tone that was not his. "Open then, child of the snake!" Bagaz let out a wailing shriek and crouched down in a corner, hiding his face. Owain started up, astonished and suddenly pale. The door swung slowly back. There was nothing behind it but darkness and a shadow. A shadow cloaked and hooded, and so crouched in the lightless cabin that it was no more than the ghost of a shadow. But it was there, and the man Karst, caught fast in the trap of his strange fate, recognized it for what it was. It was fear, the ancient evil thing that crept among the grasses in the beginning, apart from life, but watching it with eyes of cold wisdom, laughing its silent laughter, giving nothing but the bitter death. It was the serpent. The primal ape in Karst wanted to run, to hide away. Every cell of his flesh recoiled. Every instinct warned him. But he did not run, and there was an anger in him that grew until it blotted out the fear, blotted out Owain and the others, everything but the wish to destroy, utterly, the creature crouching beyond the light. His own anger? Or something greater? Something born of a shame and an agony that he could never know? A voice spoke to him out of the darkness, soft and sibilant. "You have willed it. Let it be so." There was utter silence in the cabin. Child had recoiled. Even Owain had drawn back to the end of the table. The cowering Bagaz hardly breathed. The shadow had stirred with a slight dry rustle. A spot of subdued brilliance had appeared, held by unseen hands, a brilliance that shed no glow around it. It seemed to Karst like a ring of little stars, incredibly distant. The stars began to move, to circle their hidden orbit, to spin faster and faster until they became a wheel, peculiarly blurred. From them now came a thin high note, a crystal song that was like infinity, without beginning or end. A song, a call, attuned to his hearing alone? Or was it his hearing? He could not tell. Perhaps he heard it with his flesh instead, with every quivering nerve. The others, Owain and Child and Bagaz, seemed unaffected. Karst felt a coldness stealing over him. It was as though those tiny singing stars called to him across the universe, charming him out into the deeps of space, where the empty cosmos sucked him dry of warmth and life. His muscles loosened. He felt his sinews melt and flow away on the icy tide. He felt his brain dissolving. He went slowly to his knees. The little stars sang on and on. He understood them now. They were asking him a question. He knew that when he answered, he could sleep. He would not wake again, but that did not matter. He was afraid now, but if he slept, he would forget his fear. Fear. Fear! The old radical terror that haunts the soul,
the dread that slides in the quiet dark. In sleep and death, he could forget that fear. He need only answer that hypnotic, whispered question. Where is the tomb? Answer. Speak. But something still chained his tongue. The red flame of anger still flickered in him, fighting the brilliance of the singing stars. He struggled, but the star song was too strong. He heard his dry lips slowly speaking. The tomb, the place of Rhiannon. Rhiannon, dark father who taught you power, thou spawn of the serpent's egg. The name rang in like a battle cry. His rage soared up. The smoky jewel in the hilt of the sword on the table seemed suddenly to call to his hand. He leaped and grasped its hilt. Owain sprang forward with a startled cry, but it was too late. The great jewel seemed to blaze, to catch up the power of the singing, shining stars and hurl it back. The crystal song keened and broke. The brilliance faded. He had shattered the strange hypnosis. Blood flowed again into Kars's veins. The sword felt alive in his hands. He shouted the name Rhiannon and plunged forward into the dark. He heard a hissing scream as his long blade went home to the heart of the shadow. 9. Galley of Death. Kars straightened slowly and turned in the doorway, his back to the thing he had slain but had not seen. He had no wish to see it. He was utterly shaken and in a strange mood, full of a vaulting strength that verged on madness. The hysteria, he thought, that comes when you've taken too much, when the walls close in and there's nothing to do but fight before you die. The cabin was full of a stunned silence. Child had the staring look of an idiot, his mouth fallen open. Owain had put one hand to the edge of the table, and it was strange to see in her that one small sign of weakness. She had not taken her eyes from Kars. She said huskily, Are you man or demon that you can stand against Caer-Du? Kars did not answer. He was beyond speech. Her face floated before him like a silver mask. He remembered the pain, the shameful labor at the sweep, the scars of the lash that he carried. He remembered the voice that had said to Callus, Teach him. He had slain the serpent. After that, it seemed an easy thing to kill a queen. He began to move, covering the few short steps that lay between them, and there was something terrible about the slow purposefulness of it. The galled and shackled slave carrying the great sword, its blade dark with alien blood. Owain gave back one step. Her hand faltered to her own hilt. She was not afraid of death. She was afraid of the thing that she saw in Kars, the light that blazed in his eyes. A fear of the soul, and not the body. Child gave a hoarse cry. He drew his sword and lunged. They had all forgotten Bogaz, crouching quiet in his corner. Now the Valkesian rose to his feet, handling his great bulk with unbelievable speed. As Child passed him, he raised both hands and brought the full weight of his gyves down with tremendous strength on the Sark's head. Child dropped like a stone. And now Owain had found her pride again. The sword of Rhiannon rose high for the death stroke, and quick as lightning, she drew her own short blade and parried it as it fell. The force of the blow drove her weapon out of her hands. Kars had only to strike again. But it seemed that with that effort, something had gone out of him. He saw her mouth open to voice an angry shout for aid, and he struck her across the face with his hilt reversed, so that she slid stunned to the deck, her cheek laid open. And then Bogaz was thrusting him back, saying, Don't kill her! We may buy our lives with hers! Kars watched as Bogaz bound and gagged her and took the dagger from her belt sheath.
It occurred to him that they were two slaves who had overpowered Owain of Sark and struck down her captain, and that the lives of Mat Kars and Bagaz of Valkis were worth less than a puff of wind as soon as it was discovered. So far, they were safe. There had been little noise, and there were no sounds of alarm outside. Bagaz shut the inner door as though to block off even the memory of what lay within. Then he took a closer look at Scyld, who was quite dead. He picked up the man's sword and stood still for a minute, catching his breath. He was staring at Kars with a new respect that had in it both awe and fear. Glancing at the closed door, he muttered, "I would not have believed it possible, and yet I saw it." He turned back to Kars. "You cried out upon Rhiannon before you struck. Why?" Kars said impatiently, "How can a man know what he's saying at a time like that?" The truth was that he didn't know himself why he had spoken the Cursed One's name, except that it had been thrust at him so often that he supposed it had become a sort of obsession. The Duvian's little hypnosis gadget had thrown his whole mind off balance for a while. He remembered only a towering rage. The gods knew he had had enough to make any man angry. It was probably not so strange that the Duvian's hypnotic science hadn't been able to put him completely under. After all, he was an Earthman and a product of another age. Even so, it had been a near thing, horribly near. He didn't want to think about it anymore. "That's over now. Forget it. We've got to think how to get ourselves out of this mess." Bagaz's courage seemed to have drained away. He said glumly, "We'd better kill ourselves at once and have done with it." He meant it. Kars said, "If you feel that way, why did you strike out to save my life?" "I don't know. Instinct, I suppose." "All right. My instinct is to go on living as long as possible." It didn't look as though that would be very long, but he was not going to take Bagaz's advice and fall upon the sword of Rhiannon. He weighted it in his hands, scowling, and then looked from it to his fetters. He said suddenly, "If we could free the rowers, they'd fight. They're all condemned for life. Nothing to lose. We might take the ship." Bagaz's eyes widened, then narrowed shrewdly. He thought it over. Then he shrugged. "I suppose one can always die. It's worth trying. Anything's worth trying." He tested the point of Owain's dagger. It was thin and strong. With infinite skill, he began to pick the lock of the Earthman's gyves. "You have a plan?" he asked. Kars grunted. "I'm no magician. I can only try." He glanced at Owain. "You stay here, Bagaz. Barricade the door. Guard her. If things go wrong, she's our last and only hope." The cuffs hung loose now on his wrist and ankles. Reluctantly, he laid down the sword. Bagaz would need the dagger to free himself, but there was another one on Scyld's body. Kars took it and hid it under his kilt. As he did so, he gave Bagaz a few brief instructions. A moment later, Kars opened the cabin door just widely enough to step outside. From behind him came a good enough imitation of Scyld's gruff voice calling for a guard. A soldier came. "Take this slave back to the ore bank," ordered the voice that aped Scyld's, "and see that the Lady Owain is not disturbed." The man saluted and began to herd the shuffling Kars away. The cabin door banged shut, and Kars heard the sound of the bar dropping into place. Across the deck and down the ladder. "Count the soldiers. Think how it must be done." "No, don't think. Don't, or you'll never try it." The drummer, who was a slave himself. The two swimmers. The overseer, up at the forward end of the catwalk, lashing a rower. Rows of shoulders, bending over the oars, back and forth. Rows of faces above them. The faces of rats, of jackals, of wolves. The creak and groan of the looms, the reek of sweat and bilge water, the incessant beat, beat, beat of the drum. The soldier turned Karst over to Callus and went away. Jaxart was back on the oar, and with him a lean Sark convict with a brand on his face. They glanced up at Karst and then away again. Callus thrust the Earthman roughly onto the bench, where he bent low over the oar. Callus stopped to fix the master chain to his leg irons, growling as he did so. "Oh, I hope that Owain lets me have you when she's all through with you, carrion. I'll have fun while you last." Callus stopped very suddenly and said no more. Then or ever. Karst had stabbed his heart with such swift neatness that not even Callus was aware of the stroke until he ceased to breathe. "Keep stroke," snarled Karst to Jaxart under his breath. The big Khand obeyed. A smoldering light came into his eyes. The branded man laughed once, silently, with a terrible eagerness. Karst cut the key to the master locks, free from its thong on Callus's girdle, and let the corpse down gently into the bilges. The man across the catwalk on the port oar had seen, as had the drummer. "Keep stroke," said Karst again, and Jaxart glared, and the stroke was kept. But the drumbeat faltered and died. Karst shook off his manacles. His eyes met the drummer's, and the rhythm started again, but already the overseer was on his way aft, shouting, "What's the matter there, you pig?" "My arms are weary," the man quavered. "Weary, are they? I'll weary your back for you, too, if it happens again." The man on the port oar, a Khand, said deliberately, "Much is going to happen, you Sark scum." He took his hands off the oar. The overseer advanced upon him. "Is it now? Why, the filth is a very prophet." His lash rose and fell once, and then Karst was on him. One hand clamped the man's mouth shut, and the other plunged the dagger in. Swiftly, silently, the second body rolled into the bilges. A deep animal cry broke out along the oarbank, and was choked down as Karst raised his arms in a warning gesture, looking upward at the deck. No one had noticed yet. There had been nothing to draw notice. Inevitably, the rhythm of the oars had broken, but that was not unusual, and in any case, it was the concern of the overseer. Unless it stopped altogether, no one would wonder. If luck would only hold. The drummer had the sense or the habit to keep on. Karst passed the word along. "Keep stroke, until we're all free." The beat picked up again, slowly. Crouching low, Karst opened the master locks. The men needed no warning to be easy with their chains as they freed themselves, one by one. Even so, less than half of them were loose when an idle soldier chose to lean on the deck rail and look down. Karst had just finished releasing the swimmers. He saw the man's expression change from boredom to incredulous awareness, and he caught up the overseer's whip and sent the long lash swinging upward. The soldier bellowed the alarm as the lash coiled around his neck and brought him crashing down into the pit. Karst leaped to the ladder. "Come on, you scum, you rabble!" he shouted. "Here's your chance!" And they were after him like one man, roaring the beast roar of creatures hungry for vengeance and blood. Up the ladder they poured, swinging their chains, and those that were still held to the benches worked like madmen to be free. They had the brief advantage of surprise, for the attack had come so quickly on the heels of the alarm that swords were still half drawn, bows still unstrung. But it wouldn't last long. Karst knew well how short a time it would last. "Strike! Strike hard while you can!" With belaying pins, with their shackles, and with their fists, The galley slaves charged in, and the soldiers met them. Karst with his whip and his knife, Jaxart howling the word condor like a battle cry, naked bodies against male, desperation against discipline. The swimmers slipped like brown shadows through the fray, and the slave with the broken wings had somehow possessed himself of a sword. Seamen reinforced the soldiers, but still the wolves came up out of the pit. From the forecastle and the steersman platform, bowmen began to take their toll, but the fight became so closely locked that they had to stop for fear of killing their own men. The salt-sweet smell of blood rose on the air. The decks were slippery with it. Karst saw that the slaves were being driven back, and the number of dead was growing. In a furious surge, he broke through to the cabin. The Sarks must have thought it strange that Owain and Child had not appeared, but they had had little time to do anything about it. Karst pounded on the cabin door, shouting Bagaz's name. The Valkesian drew the bar, and Karst burst in. "Carry the wench up to the steersman platform," he panted. "I'll cut your way." He snatched up the sword of Rhiannon, and went out again with Bagaz behind him, bearing Owain in his arms. The latter was only a short 2 paces from the door. The bowmen had come down to fight, and there was no one up on the platform but the frightened Sark sailor who clung to the tiller bar. Karst, swinging the great sword, cleared the way and held the ladder foot while Bagaz climbed up and set Owain on her feet where all could see her. "Look you!" he bellowed. "We have Owain!" He did not need to tell them. The sight of her, bound and gagged in the hands of a slave, was like a blow to the soldiers and like a magic potion to the rebels. 2 mingled sounds went up, a groan and a cheer. Someone found Child's body and dragged it out on deck. Doubly leaderless now, the Sarks lost heart. The tide of battle turned then, and the slaves took their advantage in both hands. The sword of Rhiannon led them. It slashed the halyards that brought the dragon flag of Sark plunging down from the masthead, and under its blade the last Sark soldier died. There was an abrupt cessation of sound and movement. The black galley drifted with a freshening wind. The sun was low on the horizon. Karst climbed wearily to the steersman's platform. Owain, still fast in Bagaz's grip, followed him, eyes full of hellfire. Karst went to the forward edge of the platform and stood leaning on the sword. The slaves, exhausted with fighting and drunk with victory, gathered on the deck below like a ring of panting wolves. Jaxart came out from searching the cabins. He shook his dripping blade up at Owain and shouted, "A fine lover she kept in her cabin, the spawn of Caerdu, the stinking serpent." There was an instant reaction from the slaves. They were tense and bristling again at that name, afraid even in their numbers. Karst made his voice hard with difficulty. "The thing is dead. Jaxart, will you cleanse the ship?" Jaxart paused before he turned to obey. "How did you know it was dead?" Karst said, "I killed it." The men stared up at him as though he were something more than human. The awed muttering went around. "He slew the serpent?" With another man, Jaxart returned to the cabin and brought the body out. No word was spoken. A wide lane was cleared to the lee rail, and the black, shrouded thing was carried along it, faceless, formless, hidden in its robe and cowl, symbol even in death of infinite evil. Again, Karst fought down that cold, repellent fear and the touch of strange anger. He forced himself to watch. The splash it made as it fell was shockingly loud in the stillness. Ripples spread in little lines of fire and died away. Then men began to talk again. They began to shout up to Owain, taunting her. Someone yelled for her blood, and there would have been a stampede up the ladder. but that Kars threatened them with his long blade.
"No, she's our hostage, and worth her weight in gold."
He did not specify how, but he knew the argument would satisfy them for a while. And much as he hated Owain, he somehow did not want to see her torn to pieces by this pack of wild beasts. He steered their thoughts to another subject.
"We have to have a leader now. Whom will you choose?"
There was only one answer to that. They roared his name until it deafened him, and Kars felt a savage pleasure at the sound of it. After days of torment, it was good to know he was a man again, even in an alien world. When he could make himself heard, he said, "All right, now listen well. The Sarks will kill us by slow death for what we've done, if they catch us. So here's my plan. We'll join the free rovers, the sea kings who lair at Condor." To the last man they agreed, and the name Condor rang up into the sunset sky. The Khans among the slaves were like wild men. One of them stripped a length of yellow cloth from the tunic of a dead soldier, fashioned a banner out of it, and ran it up in place of the dragon flag of Sark. At Kars's request, Jaxart took over the handling of the galley, and Bagaz carried Owain down again and locked her in the cabin. The men dispersed, eager to be rid of their shackles, eager to loot the bodies of clothes and weapons and to dip into the wine casks. Only Naram and Shala remained, looking up at Kars in the afterglow. "Do you disagree?" he asked them. Shala's eyes glowed with the same eerie light that he had seen in them before.
"You are a stranger," she said softly. "Stranger to us, stranger to our world. And I say again that I can sense a black shadow in you that makes me afraid, for you will cast it wherever you go."
She turned from him then, and Naram said, "We go homeward now." The two swimmers poised for a moment on the rail. They were free now, free of their chains, and their bodies ached with the joy of it, stretching upward, supple, sure. Then they vanished overside. After a moment, Kars saw them again, rolling and plunging like dolphins, racing each other, calling to each other in their soft, clear voices as they made the waves foam flame. Deimos was already high. The afterglow was gone, and Phobos came up swiftly out of the east. The sea turned glowing silver. The swimmers went away toward the west, trailing their wakes of fire, a tracery of sparkling light that grew fainter and vanished altogether. The black galley stood on for Condor, her taut sails dark against the sea, and Kars remained as he was, standing on the platform, holding the sword of Rhiannon between his hands. 10. The Sea Kings. Kars was leaning on the rail, watching the sea, when the sky folk came. Time and distance had dropped behind the galley. Kars had rested. He wore a clean kilt. He was washed and shaven. His wounds were healing. He had regained his ornaments, and the hilt of the long sword gleamed above his left shoulder. Bagaz was beside him. Bagaz was always beside him. He pointed now to the western sky and said, "Look there." Kars saw what he took to be a flight of birds in the distance. But they grew rapidly larger, and presently he realized that they were men, or half-men, like the slave with the broken wings. They were not slaves, and their wings stretched wide, flashing in the sun. Their slim bodies, completely naked, gleamed like ivory. They were incredibly beautiful, arrowing down out of the blue. They had a kinship with the swimmers. The swimmers were the perfect children of the sea. and these were brother to wind and cloud, and the clean immensity of the sky. It was as though some master hand had shaped them both out of separate elements, molding them in strength and grace that was freed from all the earth-bound clumsiness of men, dreams made into joyous flesh. Jaxart, who was at the helm, called down to them, "Scouts from Condor!" Karst mounted to the platform. The men gathered on the deck to watch as the four skyfolk came down in a soaring rush. Karst glanced forward to the sheer of the prow. Lorn, the winged slave, had taken to brooding there by himself, speaking to no one. Now he stood erect, and one of the four went to him. The others came to rest on the platform, folding their bright wings with a whispering rustle. They greeted Jaxart by name, looking curiously at the long black galley and the hard-bitten mongrel crew that sailed her, and, above all, at Karst. There was something in their searching gaze that reminded the Earthman uncomfortably of Shala. "Our chief," Jaxart told them. "A barbarian from the back door of Mars, but a man of his hands, and no fool either. The swimmers will have told the tale, how he took the ship and Owain of Sark together." "Aye," they acknowledged Karst with grave curiosity. The Earthman said, "Jaxart has told me that all who fight Sark may have freedom of Condor. I claim that right." "We will carry word to Rold, who heads the Council of the Sea Kings." The Khans on deck began to shout their own messages then, the eager words of men who have been a long time away from home. The Sky Men answered in their clear, sweet voices, and presently darted away, their opinions beating up into the blue air, higher and higher, growing tiny in the distance. Lorn remained standing in the bow, watching until there was nothing left but empty sky. "We'll raise Condor soon," said Jaxart, and Karst turned to speak to him. Then some instinct made him look back, and he saw that Lorn was gone. There was no sign of him in the water. He had gone overside without a sound, and he must have sunk like a drowning bird, pulled down by the weight of his useless wings. Jaxart growled, "It was his will, and better so." He cursed the Sarks, and Karst smiled an ugly smile. "Take heart," he said. "We may thrash them yet. How is it that Condor has held out when Jakara and Valkis fell?" "Because not even the scientific weapons of the Sark's evil allies, the Duvians, can touch us there. You'll understand why when you see Condor." Before noon they sighted land, a rocky and forbidding coast. The cliffs rose sheer out of the sea, and behind them forested mountains towered like a giant's wall. Here and there a narrow fjord sheltered a fishing village, and an occasional lonely steadin clung to the high pasture land, a collar of white flame along the cliffs. Karst sent Bagaz to the cabin for Owain. She had remained there under guard, and he had not seen her since the mutiny, except once. It had been the first night after the mutiny. He had, with Bagaz and Jaxart, been examining the strange instruments that they had found in the inner cabin of the Duvian. "These are Duvian weapons that only they know how to use," Bagaz had declared. "Now we know why Owain had no escort ship. She needed none with a Duvian and his weapons aboard her galley." Jaxart looked at the things with loathing and fear. "Science of the accursed serpent. We should throw them after his body." "No," Karst said, examining the things. "If it were possible to discover the way in which these devices operate." He had soon found that it would not be possible without prolonged study. He knew science fairly well, yes, but it was the science of his own different world. These instruments had been built out of a scientific knowledge alien in nearly every way to his own. The science of Rhiannon, of which these Duvian weapons represented but a small part. Karsh should recognize the little hypnosis machine that the Duvian had used upon him in the dark. A little metal wheel set with crystal stars that revolved by a slight pressure of the fingers, and when he set it turning, it whispered a singing note that so chilled his blood with memory that he hastily set the thing down. The other Duvian instruments were even more incomprehensible. One consisted of a large lens surrounded by oddly asymmetrical crystal prisms. Another had a heavy metal base in which flat metal vibrations were mounted. He could only guess that these weapons exploited the laws of alien and subtle optical and sonic sciences.
"No man can understand the Duvian science," muttered Jaxart. "Not even the Sox, who have alliance with the serpent."
He stared at the instruments with a half-superstitious hatred of a non-scientific folk for mechanical purposes. But perhaps Owain, who was daughter of Sark's king, might know, Karsh speculated. It's worth trying. He went to the cabin where she was being guarded with that purpose in mind. Owain sat there, and she wore now the shackles he had worn. He came in upon her suddenly, catching her as she sat with her head bowed and her shoulders bent in utter weariness. But at the sound of the door, she straightened and watched him, level-eyed. He saw how white her face was, and how the shadow lay in the hollows of the bones. He did not speak for a long time. He had no pity for her. He looked at her, liking the taste of victory, liking the thought that he could do what he wanted with her. When he asked her about the Duvian scientific weapons they had found, Owain laughed mirthlessly. "You must be an ignorant barbarian indeed, if you think the Duvians would instruct even me in their science. One of them came with me to overawe with those things the Jakaran ruler, who was waxing rebellious. But Sasan would not let me even touch those things." Karsh believed her. It accorded with what Jaxart had said, that the Duvians jealously guarded their scientific weapons from even their allies, the Sarks. "Besides," Owain said mockingly, "why should Duvian science interest you, if you hold the key to the far greater science locked in Rhiannon's tomb?" "I do hold that key, and that secret," Karsh told her, and his answer took the mockery out of her face. "What are you going to do with it?" she asked. "On that," Karsh said grimly, "my mind is clear. Whatever power that tomb gives me, I'll use against Sark and the Caer-Du. And I hope it's enough to destroy you down to the last stone in your city." Owain nodded. "Well answered. And now, what about me? Will you have me flogged and chained to an oar? Or will you kill me here?" He shook his head slowly, answering her last question. "I could have let my wolves tear you if I had wished you killed now." Her teeth showed briefly in what might have been a smile. "Small satisfaction in that. Not like doing it with one's own hands." "I might have done that too, here in the cabin." "And you tried, yet did not. Well then, what?" Karsh did not answer. It came to him that, whatever he might do to her, she would still mock him to the very end. There was the steel of pride in this woman. He had marked her, though. The gash on her cheek would heal and fade, but never vanish. She would never forget him as long as she lived. He was glad he had marked her. "No answer?" she mocked. "You're full of indecision for a conqueror." Karsh went around the table to her with a pantherish step. He still did not answer, because he did not know. He only knew that he hated her, as he had never hated anything in his life before. He bent over her, his face dead white, his hands open and hungry. She reached up swiftly and found his throat. Her fingers were as strong as steel, and the nails bit deep. He caught her wrists and bent them away, the muscles of his arms standing out like ropes against her strength. She strove against him in silent fury, and then suddenly she broke. Her lips parted as she strained for breath, and Carr suddenly set his own lips against them. There was no love, no tenderness in that kiss. It was a gesture of male contempt, brutal and full of hate. Yet for one strange moment, then her sharp teeth had met his lower lip, and his mouth was full of blood, and she was laughing. "You barbarian swine," she whispered. "Now my brand is on you." He stood looking at her. Then he reached out and caught her by the shoulders, and the chair went over with a crash. "Go ahead," she said, "if it pleases you." He wanted to break her between his two hands. He thrust her from him and went out, and he had not passed the door since. Now he fingered the new scar on his lip and watched her come onto the deck with Bagaz. She stood very straight in her jeweled hauberk, but the lines around her mouth were deeper, and her eyes, for all their bitter pride, were somber. He did not go to her. She was left alone with her guard, and Kars could glance at her covertly. It was easy to guess what was in her mind. She was thinking how it felt to stand on the deck of her own ship, a prisoner. She was thinking that the brooding coast ahead was the end of all her voyaging. She was thinking that she was going to die. The cry came down from the masthead. "Condor!" Carr saw at first only a great craggy rock that towered high above the surf, a sort of blunt cape between two fjords. Then, from that seemingly barren and uninhabitable place, sky folk came flying until the air throbbed with the beating of their wings. Swimmers came also, like a swarm of little comets that left trails of fire in the sea. And from the fjord mouths came longships, smaller than the galley, swift as hornets, with shields along their sides. The voyage was over. The black galley was escorted with cheers and shouting into Condor. Kars understood now what Jaxart had meant. Nature had made a virtually impregnable fortress out of the rock itself, walled in by impassable mountains from land attack, protected by unscalable cliffs from the sea, its only gateway the narrow twisting fjord on the north side. That too was guarded by ballistas, which could make the fjord a death trap for any ship that entered it. The tortuous channel widened at the end into a landlocked harbor that not even the winds could attack. Conned longships, fishing boats, and a scattering of foreign craft filled the basin, and the black galley glided like a queen among them. The quays and the dizzy flight of steps that led up to the summit of the rock, connecting on the upper levels with tunneled galleries, were thronged with the people of Condor and the allied clans that had taken refuge with them. They were a hardy lot, with a raffish, sturdy look that Kars liked. The cliffs and the mountain peaks flung back their cheering in deafening echoes. Under cover of the noise, Bagaz said urgently to Kars for the 100th time, "Let me bargain with them for the secret. I can get us each a kingdom, more if you will." And for the 100th time, Kars answered, "I have not said that I know the secret. If I do, it is my own." Bagaz swore in an ecstasy of frustration and demanded of the gods what he had done to be thus hardly used. Owain's eyes turned upon the Earthman once, and then away. Swimmers in their gleaming hundreds, sky folk with their proud wings folded. For the first time, Kars saw their women, creatures so exquisitely lovely that it hurt to look at them. The tall, fair Khans, and the foreign stocks, a kaleidoscope of colors and glinting steel. Mooring lines snaked out, were caught and snubbed around the bollards. The galley came to rest. Kars led his crew ashore, and Owain walked erect beside him, wearing his shackles as though they were golden ornaments she had chosen to become her. There was a group standing apart on the quay, waiting. A handful of hard-bitten men who looked as though seawater ran in their veins instead of blood. Tough veterans of many battles, some fierce and dark-visaged, some with ruddy, laughing faces, one with cheek and sword arm hideously burned and scarred. Among them was a tall Khand with a look of harnessed lightning about him, and hair the color of new copper, and by his side stood a girl dressed in a blue robe. Her straight fair hair was bound back by a fillet of plain gold, and between her breasts, left bare by the loose outer garment, a single black pearl glowed with lustrous darkness. Her left hand rested on the shoulder of Shala the swimmer. Like all the rest, the girl was paying more attention to Owain than she was to Kars. He realized somehow bitterly that the whole crowd had gathered less to see the unknown barbarian who had done it all than to see the daughter of Gareth of Sark walking in chains. The red-haired Khand remembered his manners enough to make the sign of peace and say, "I am Rold of Condor. We, the Sea Kings, make you welcome." Kars responded, but saw that already he was half forgotten in the man's savage pleasure at the plight of his archenemy. They had much to say to each other, Owain and the Sea Kings. Kars looked again at the girl. He had heard Jaxart's eager greeting to her, and knew now that she was Emer, Rold's sister. He had never seen anyone like her before. There was a touch of the Fae, of the Elfin, about her, as though she lived in the human world by courtesy and could leave it at any time she chose. Her eyes were gray and sad, but her mouth was gentle and shaped for laughter. Her body had the same quick grace he had noticed in the halflings, and yet it was a very humanly lovely body. She had pride, too, pride to match Owain's own, though they were so different. Owain was all brilliance and fire and passion, a rose with blood-red petals. Kars understood her. He could play her own game and beat her at it. But he knew that he would never understand Emer. She was part of all the things he had left behind him long ago. She was the lost music and the forgotten dreams, the pity and the tenderness, the whole shadowy world he had glimpsed in childhood, but never since. All at once she looked up and saw him. Her eyes met his, met and held, and would not go away. He saw their expression change. He saw every drop of color drain from her face, until it was like a mask of snow. He heard her say, "Who are you?" He bent his head. "Lady Emer, I am Kars the barbarian." He saw how her fingers dug into Shala's fur, and saw how the swimmer watched him with her soft, hostile gaze. Emer's voice answered, almost below the threshold of hearing. "You have no name. You are, as Shala said, a stranger." Something about the way she said the word made it seem full of an eerie menace, and it was so uncannily close to the truth. He sensed suddenly that this girl had the same extrasensory power as the halflings, developed in her human brain to even greater strength. But he forced a laugh. "You must have many strangers in Condor these days." He glanced at the swimmer. "Shala distrusts me. I don't know why. Did she tell you also that I carry a dark shadow with me wherever I go?" "She did not need to tell me," Emer whispered. "Your face is only a mask, and behind it is a darkness and a wish.
and they are not of our world." She came to him with slow steps, as though drawn against her will. He could see the dew of sweat on her forehead, and abruptly he began to tremble himself, a shivering deep within him that was not of the flesh. "I can see. I can almost see." He did not want her to say any more. He did not want to hear it. "No," he cried out. "No!" She suddenly fell forward, her body heavy against him. He caught her and eased her down to the gray rock, where she lay in a dead faint. He knelt helplessly beside her, but Shala said quietly, "I will care for her." He stood up, and then rolled, and the Sea Kings were around him like a ring of startled eagles. "The seeing was upon her," Shala told them. "But it has never taken her like this before," Rold said worriedly. "What happened? My thought was all on Owain." "What happened is between Lady Amer and the stranger," said Shala. She picked up the girl in her strong arms and bore her away. Kars felt that strange inner fear still chilling him. The seeing, they had called it. Seeing indeed. Not of any supernatural kind, but of strong extrasensory powers that had looked deep into his mind. In a sudden reaction of anger, Kars said, "A fine welcome. All of us brushed aside for a look at Owain, and then your sister faints at sight of me." "By the gods!" Rold groaned. "Your pardon, we had not meant it so. As for my sister, she is too much with the halflings, and given as they are to dreams of the mind." He raised his voice. "Ho there, Ironbeard! Let us redeem our manners!" The largest of the Sea Kings, a grizzled giant with a laugh like the north wind, came forward, and before Kars realized their intention, they had tossed him onto their shoulders and marched with him up the quay, where everyone could see him. "Hark you!" Rold bellowed. "Hark!" The crowd quieted at his voice. "Here is Kars, the barbarian. He took the galley. He captured Owain. He slew the serpent. How do you greet him?" Their greeting nearly brought down the cliffs. The two big men bore Kars up the steps and would not put him down. The people of Condor streamed after them, accepting the men of his crew as their brothers. Kars caught a glimpse of Bagaz, his face one vast porcine smile, holding a giggling girl in each arm. Owain walked alone in the center of a guard of the Sea of Kings. The scarred man watched her with a brooding madness in his unwinking eyes. Rold and Ironbeard dumped Kars to his feet at the summit, panting. "You're a heavyweight, my friend," gasped Rold, grinning. "Now, does our penance satisfy you?" Kars swore, feeling shamefaced. Then he stared in wonder at the city of Condor. A monolithic city, hewn in the rock itself. The crest had been split, apparently by diastrophic convulsions in the remoter ages of Mars. All along the inner cliffs of the split were doorways and the openings of galleries, a perfect honeycomb of dwellings and giddy flights of steps. Those who had been too old or disabled to climb the long way down to the harbor cheered them now from the galleries or from the narrow streets and squares. The sea wind blew keen and cold at this height, so that there was always a throb and a wail in the streets of Condor, mingling with the booming voices of the waves below. From the upper crags there was a coming and going of the skyfolk, who seemed to like the high places, as though the streets cramped them. Their fledglings tossed on the wind, swooping and tumbling in their private games, with bursts of elfin laughter. Landward, Kars looked down upon green fields and pasture land, locked tight in the arms of the mountains. It seemed as though this place could withstand a siege forever. They went along the rocky ways with the people of Condor pouring after them, filling the airy city with shouts and laughter. There was a large square,
with two squat, strong porticos facing each other across it. One had carven pillars before it, dedicated to the god of waters and the god of the four winds. Before the other, a golden banner whipped, broidered with the eagle of Condor. At the threshold of the palace, Ironbeard clapped the Earthman on the shoulder, a staggering buffet. "There'll be heavy talk along with the feasting of the council tonight, but we have plenty of time to get decently drunk before that. How say you?" And Carr said, "Lead on."